Hi and welcome, Max Mathias here. Today we're going to be talking about demand and demand only. I know it may seem weird that I'm not talking about supply and demand together. I'm going to make an individual video about supply, and then ultimately there's going to be an individual video about supply and demand working together. This allows us to go a little bit more in depth, so without further ado, let's get started. So let's pretend that I am auctioning my phone. So I have my cell phone right here. There's my son Jack on it. So if I'm selling my phone, I think it's an iPhone 12, if that gives you any relevant information. It also has lots of cute cat photos and baby photos on it as well, right? Really trying to sell it up here. So I have a table below representing prices that I would be willing to sell for. Obviously this, so the table below, I have a table below which represents prices that I would be willing to sell the phone for. If I was doing this in class, I would be, taking polls of students. Obviously, I can't do that with this video online. So this table right here is just numbers that I have made up, right? And it's really important to say that these numbers aren't coming from anywhere particular. I am literally just making them up. So that at $500, I'm assuming no one would want to buy it, right? I don't think this phone is worth $500 anymore. At $250, let's say 5 of you want to buy it. At $100, 15 want to buy it. 50, 40, you get the idea, right? So the quantities are the number of you who would be who'd be willing to buy it at that particular price. Okay, so we're going to draw a graph here. So our axes are right there. We label the vertical axis price, which a lot of times you'll see me abbreviate with just a P. And the horizontal axis is quantity, which we abbreviate with Q. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this table and we're going to translate it onto that graph. So the first point that we care about is this $500. And at that price, no one wants to buy it. We're going to plop a point right down there. So $500, no one wants to buy it. Sad for me, but makes a lot of sense. Our next price is $250. We know 5 people want to buy it. We're going to plop a point there. We'll start kind of speeding this up. So at 100, I know 15 people want to buy it. We plop a point. At $50, 40 people want to buy it. We plop a point. And then at $10, 100 people want to buy it. And we plop a point there. So we have all of these points. The last remaining step is basically to play connect the dots between them like that. And then we're going to label that as our demand curve. So awesome job, you just drew your first demand curve. So that's really all it is in essence, is if we could go around and basically poll people for every single good at different prices, how much they'd be willing to pay, we'd be able to construct demand curves. Obviously, it's not that simple, right? In real life, we can't do that. It would just be way too much information. But this is giving you an idea of how we think about constructing a demand curve, right? It's a set of a bunch of prices and ultimately how much people want to buy. So what is demand? Well, demand itself is the relationship between the price of a particular good and the amount of it people are willing to purchase at that price. Okay, so it's important. Demand is a relationship. It's the line, right? You can think of it as a key that basically tells you how much people want to buy at any and every price you can imagine, right? So obviously there I had, $500, $250. Demand tells you more than that. It also tells you the relationship between those various points. This is where, if you've ever taken a principles of micro class, this is where it seems like we as economists are getting very kind of particular with our definitions, but quantity demanded is how much people want to buy at a given price. So demand is the relationship. Quantity demanded, I always like to think of it as a point on the line. So if we go back to our demand curve from the last slide, that point right there, $500 and 0 people wanting to buy it, that is a quantity demanded. So is that 250 and 5. So is that 115. So is the 50 and 40. And so is the 10 and 100. So each of those individual points are quantities demanded. Demand, right? So as I said, sorry, getting ahead of myself, each point in the table on the previous slide, or each point on that graph right there, is a quantity demanded. Us drawing the line there, right, like I just highlighted, basically us playing connect the dots between those points is demand itself. Demand is the entire relationship. Quantity demanded is a single point on the line. If I was teaching your principles of economics class, or if you're taking one right now, I can guarantee you'll be tested on that. We want to know the distinction. Okay, quantity demanded, point on the line. Demand, the line itself, the entire relationship. So let's generalize demand here. The graph that I've shown you on the last few slides is a particular demand curve based on a table of numbers that I made up, right? Not all demand curves look like that. We also don't need to know all of these different price quantity combinations to ultimately create a demand curve. So how do we generalize demand, or what can we think of as being a generic demand curve? Well, if we start with our axes here, and I just realized that the Q is obstructed there. I apologize, that is a Q down there in that axis. So we start with our axis there. All you do is just draw a line like that, right? This one's straight. It doesn't have to be, but a lot of times just to make life easier, we draw a straight line and then we label it with a D for demand. So what do you notice, or what are the similarities between that line I drew and the one I had on the previous couple slides? It's downward sloping, right? That is the one thing that those two share, is that there is a downward slope, right? Moving from left to right, the graph is moving down that way. So what does that mean? It means that as prices go down, that is, the good becomes cheaper, people want to buy more of it. Also vice versa. So basically that means as price goes up, people want to buy less. That's really all it means. And that sentence right there, as prices go down, people want to buy more and vice versa, that's called the law of demand, right? So basically all the law of demand says is that something gets cheaper, you want to buy more of it. I'm hoping for, some of you that's relatively intuitive, right? If you go to a store, or if, something that you notice you buy over and over and over again, if it becomes cheaper, maybe you buy more of it. Maybe you don't, that's okay. But generally speaking, we think that as goods become cheaper, people tend to buy more of them. I want you to think, is there an instance where you would buy more of something if it became more expensive? Right. And important, I'm talking about the same thing. I'm not talking about potentially switching between goods. I know in reality, a lot of times, if there's like an unknown quantity, if it's cheap, it is pretty scary for us, right? Like, so, if you're buying a medication or something, a lot of people don't buy generic medications because, they don't know, right? Like people buy Tylenol instead of acetaminophen or something like that. Why? Because they think that the brand name is going to work or whatever. It has more information associated with it. Right now, we're kind of sweeping that away. We're assuming everything that is relevant to know about the good, you know about, right? So knowing, the general kind of quality or whatever, if that same good became more expensive, would you buy more of it? Probably not. And actually, economists have gone out and tried to look for instances like this out, in the real world. And honestly, we really haven't found a good case of one being. So put another way, there's a reason why we call it the law of demand, right? In the sense that, in very rare instances, ones that honestly we haven't even documented that well, generally we assume that as a good becomes cheaper, people buy less of it and vice versa. So let's talk about shifting demand here. So what do I mean? Well, you may have been thinking during, this whole kind of lecture, well, price isn't the only thing that determines how much of something I buy. I absolutely agree with you, right? What we've been doing kind of behind the scenes so far is that we're holding those things constant, right? We're assuming that they aren't changing. And in doing that, we're isolating the effect of price changes on quantity demanded, right? So, there's a whole bunch of things that go into determining how much of something you want to buy, right? More than I can name. Basically, what we're doing right now is we're saying, don't let those change, just let price change. How much does that change how much you want to buy? As soon as we start letting those things change, right? How does that affect the graph? Well, these are called demand shifts, right? So basically you can think about it as we're going to be dragging the demand curve to the right or to the left based on what's changing. On the next slide, I'll talk about some of those things, but this is kind of an important point, right? Given no other information, imagine those things are constant. Only when, we give you additional pieces of information can you assume those things change. And fundamentally, that they change that relationship, right? They move it. So let's talk about what shifts demand. And I should say these are in no particular order, right? One is not better than the other or anything like that. This is just the order they kind of, came to me as I wrote them down. First is number of buyers. All right, so generally we think that as the number of buyers in a particular market increases, we would say demand increases. And we generally demand increases, you can say demand shifts to the right. Those mean the same thing. Also vice versa. Less buyers, demand decreases. So you can imagine kind of a situation where if I was selling my phone to say just one of you, well, the highest demand is ever going to be is one, right? Or I should say quantity demanded, right? There's only one of you, you can buy one phone, things like that. if I ask more and more people, right? So if I go from asking my classroom full of students to the Air Force Academy in general to, let's say, the state of Colorado, I would assume that at any given price, now more and more people would be willing to buy it than before, simply because I've increased the number of buyers, right? And what do I mean by demand increasing here? Well, it means that basically at every price, quantity demanded is now higher than it was before, right? So hold price constant. Let's say people wanted to buy 10 before, now they want to buy 20. I don't know. Again, I'm just making up numbers there, but you get the idea. At every price, more people want to buy it than they did before. Income is another thing. Income is something that shifts demand. It also is something that we have to talk about two cases. So the first case is what we call a normal good. So with normal goods, as income increases, demand increases. I should also say all of these are vice versa as well. I just don't want to have to write and vice versa after everything. But no, for a normal good, income goes down, demand goes down too. So I don't have a particular great example of this because you encounter them all the time, right? Generally speaking, as you become wealthier, we assume you are going to buy more things than you did before, right? So things like food, things like shirts, things like, just clothing in general, other, hobbies, things like that, right? Generally, those we would consider to be normal. As you become wealthier, you buy more of them. On the other hand, are inferior goods. So inferior goods are, as you become wealthier, right, as your income increases, demand actually decreases. And again, vice versa. So if income falls, demand goes up. Here we have some pretty good examples of this. These are generally goods that we think of as being kind of inferior in quality, right? So generic medicine. So the idea is that, maybe as a poor college student, right, you have to buy generic medicine. As you become wealthier, you upgrade to, the name brand Tylenol or Aleve or whatever, and therefore you buy less of generic. Ramen noodles is a favorite amongst economists as far as providing an example, right? The typical broke college student eats ramen noodles. When they graduate and get a better job, they upgrade to, Campbell's, right? Or some other soup. I personally love ramen. I still eat it, but you get the idea. Low quality clothes, right? Going shopping at Goodwill or something like that, right? As you become wealthier, we generally assume that you're going to be buying better quality, right? Name brand clothes as opposed to low quality clothes. So this one kind of makes sense, but again, we have to consider the two cases there. In some instances, right, if I were to ask you a question on this, a lot of times, we'll say blank is normal. If we're talking about an inferior good, we'll give you an example like this. But as always, obviously, odds are I'm probably not going to be your professor. Sorry, I jumped the gun there, hit the mouse button on accident. But to keep talking about income, when in doubt, ask, right? Hey, is this normal? Is this inferior? That will always help you. All right, so price of related goods. Here is another example where we got to break it into two categories. The first category are what we call substitutes. So substitutes are goods that replace each other. And the rule is that if the price of some substitute increases, my demand for the current good increases as well. So some examples of this, like coffee and tea, right? We generally think people drink coffee or they drink tea. So the rule is like, let's say I'm looking at, demand for tea. If coffee becomes more expensive, what I'm assuming is happening in the background is people are substituting away from coffee because it's now more expensive towards tea because it's cheaper, and demand for tea increases. Coke and Pepsi, another great example, right? Pepsi becomes more expensive, people will move and buy more Coke. Again, also vice versa here. If that substitute, let's say Coke becomes cheaper, same thing's going to happen. People are going to move from Pepsi towards Coke because it's now relatively cheaper. So price of Coke goes down, demand for Pepsi goes down. Pens and pencils, right? You get the idea. With substitutes, you're buying one or the other. And again, the rule is substitute becomes more expensive. You see me buy more of X. With complements, this is the exact opposite. Notice the spelling here. After the L, it's an E, not an I. Compliments with an I is something like, hey, you look nice today. Compliments with an E are things that go together, right? So basically you are buying them together. It's an and purchase. And the rule here is if the price of a compliment increases, then demand decreases, right? Basically you're buying a bundle. And if one of those component element becomes more expensive, you're going to buy less of the bundle. So hot dog and hot dog buns, right? The idea is if, I'm getting ready for a barbecue, if all of a sudden prices of hot dogs go up, well, that would decrease my demand for hot dog buns because I'm not going to buy as many, right? These are things that kind of on their own don't have a lot of purpose or utility, but together, right, they do the job. Coffee and sugar, right? If coffee becomes more expensive, I buy less sugar, pencil and paper, right? So the idea here is that you buy both together. Our kind of ultimate example of complements that you probably haven't thought about is like your left shoe and your right shoe, right? Notice shoes are always sold as a pair. It makes no sense to sell them kind of on their own because they literally are complements that go together perfectly, right? Left shoe, right shoe, you need them together. Otherwise, no point in having them. So with complements, if the price of that complement increases, hot dogs become more expensive. Demand for hot dog buns goes down and vice versa. Taste and preferences. This I would view as kind of our catch-all category, right? So if you can't put it into one of the above categories, number of buyers, income, or price of related goods, then it's probably something related to taste and preferences. So quick example, it's fall right now. Pumpkin spice is in full swing, right? Even though now it's after Halloween, so maybe it's kind of dying out, but you get the idea. Right, our tastes and our preferences for this pumpkin spice flavor, they fluctuate over the time of year. And so basically, in the fall, demand for pumpkin spice increases big time, while in spring, it probably decreases. Textbooks would be another great example, right? Demand is high in fall or in, beginning of spring when people are just starting the semester, low otherwise. Red wine. This is one where if I have to listen to another one of those stupid news stories that is like, drinking a glass of red wine a night is equivalent to an hour at the gym or whatever, right? Those studies are flawed, beside the point. But the idea is that hearing this new information increases people's, say, tastes or preferences for red wine. So, right, hearing this positive news, demand for red wine increases. Hearing negative news, right, it's been a long time now, but Chipotle had that big thing, I feel like this was like 6 years ago, where it came out that, there was a lot of like health issues at their stores and they even had to close for a day or two to like recuperate. I can guarantee you hearing that negative thing about food quality at Chipotle decreased demand for a long time for Chipotle as a result, right? So basically you're hearing new information. How does that make you feel about this particular good? That is taste or preferences as we kind of think about them. Obviously, this is not an inclusive list. There are a lot of other things, but these are kind of four big broad categories that, if you're in a microeconomics class, you can probably put it into one of these when a professor asks you. What's important here is that price is not something that shifts demand, right? Why is that? Well, changes in price are simply reflected by moving along the demand curve, right? So a change in quantity demanded. So that is another real kind of gotcha question for these principles of micro classes, is that if, we have this list of things that what shifts demand, price itself does not. We already know that a change in price just means you move along the demand curve, right? It's a change in quantity demanded. It's not actually shifting the demand curve itself. So we've talked a lot about these shifts. Let's draw them. So let's talk about a demand increase. So if we have a demand curve over here, right, we have our axes labeled P and Q, and then we have our downward sloping demand curve. How do we draw a demand increase? Well, imagine you're literally taking that curve and you're dragging it to the right? And I want you to get into the habit of saying demand shifts out or shifts to the right when discussing these increases. It may be tempting to say something like shifts up, but the reason I want you to not say that is because a shift up of a supply curve is actually a decrease in supply. But if you're saying shift to the right or shifts out, you'll always be correct whether talking about demand or supply. This is a personal kind of bugaboo of mine, but again, if you get in the habit of saying it shifts to the right when you're talking about demand increases, you're going to be golden. And as I said, it's really easy to get confused, so if you just kind of commit now to saying shifts right, you'll be good. Demand decreases, we're now taking this original blue demand curve and we're dragging it to the left, right? And again, what this literally means is at any given price, quantity demanded has fallen. And again, get in the habit of saying demand shifts left or shifts in. Don't say it shifts down, because again, a shift down of supply is an increase, right? So get in the habit, increases are always shifts to the right, decreases are always shifts to the left, and you'll be golden. All right, so let's do a quick recap here. We had a lot of information, bullet point summary. Demand is a relationship between the price of a good and how much people want to buy. Right, that how much people want to buy at a particular price is quantity demanded. Here's a hint for you. If you are given a particular price, it's a quantity demanded, right? To know quantity demanded, you got to tell me the price. But demand itself is the relationship. And it's a negative relationship. It's basically, if one goes up, the other necessarily goes down. Price goes up, right? Becomes more expensive. People buy less. Quantity demanded goes down, and vice versa. Price goes down. People buy more. You get the idea. Another thing, a multitude of things can quote unquote shift demand. Price is never one of those things, right? Again, changes in price are simply movements along the demand curve or changes in quantity demanded. All right. Awesome. So with that, thank you so much for watching. If you got anything out of this video, please consider liking and or subscribing so more people can see it. If you have any questions, comments about what I did, further explanation needed or anything like that, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.